Hello French Wheelchair Gang, Theris here and welcome back to another Doctor Who themed video. Now we're doing something a little bit different today. I thought I'd read an article, no one's ever done that on the history of this platform before, so I thought I'd break the mold and be the first one to do it. But before we get into it, if you could just do me a teeny tiny little favour and click that subscribe button, that would be ever so much appreciated. We are trying to get to 10k by the end of the year and I would absolutely love it if we could get there. But with that said, let's get into the article. Now this one is from our friends over at ScreenRant. It's called What Went Wrong with Chris Chibnall's Doctor Who. Now, you guys know I have my own opinions on this, so it'll be interesting to see what ScreenRant believes are the reasons and what it believes perhaps aren't the reasons as to why this era has its issues. Chris Chibnall's tenure as Doctor Who showrunner is coming to an end, but why has his period of the show been so problematic? And this was posted a little while ago, but I've only just seen it now, so I thought it might be fun to just talk about, I guess. Doctor Who showrunner Chris Chibnall has confirmed that he is departing after 2022. But what went wrong with his tenure? Chris Chibnall grew up with Doctor Who, even after appearing on a BBC discussion programme in 1986 as a representative of the Doctor Who Appreciation Society. It was no doubt his dream to become the showrunner, taking over from Stephen Moffat and introducing Jodie Whittaker as the first female Doctor. I will say, just before we get into this properly, that just because you are a fan, it doesn't by virtue mean that you're a good choice to take over as showrunner. I think actually, if anything, if someone is too much of a fan, it can seep into the quality of the show. I think we saw this in the Moffat era to some degree, specifically towards the end, where it felt like things were just done because he wanted them to be a thing, and weren't done really because they made any sense. And I think with Chibnall as well, it's very obvious that The Timeless Child is something he's wanted to see for a very long time. But the problem is, when you're running a show for a mass collective, you kind of have to let what you want on your own aside in favour of what's going to befit the show the best. Now that's not me saying that you can't have unique visions for the show, but what I am saying is, sometimes in life we have to be steady and give up the things we want the most, even our dreams. But the Chibnall era has hardly been an unqualified success. Doctor Who has never looked better, with the showrunner attempting to improve the show's production value, but scripts and character work have been heavily criticised. The fan base has grown increasingly critical and divided, especially in the light of the Timeless Child retcon at the end of Doctor Who Season 12. Chibnall has now confirmed he is departing Doctor Who after Season 13 and 3 specials that will air in 2022, meaning this controversial period is coming to an end. And there's just his quote about him leaving, which I've already spoken about in great depth. Naturally, this news means it's the right moment to take a retrospective at the Chibnall era, which is kind of funny, can I just say, because it just feels like, to a certain point, the Chibnall era has only just began, and we're already looking back at it retrospectively. And obviously I understand the reason why, and I'm doing this myself, so I'm not saying ScreenRant's doing anything wrong here, but it just seems interesting to be looking back retrospectively at something that feels as though, to a lot of people, like it's only just been getting started. I think part of that comes down to things like the gap years and things like that. Chris Chibnall's love of classic Who was a problem. This is something I alluded to earlier, obviously talking about Stephen Moffat, but it does definitely apply to Chris Chibnall as well. Doctor Who has a long and prestigious history, and as anyone would expect, its continuity has become pretty convoluted over time. Russell T Davies used the Time War to wipe the slate clean, establishing a new status quo in which viewers old and new both had to get to know this mysterious time traveller from scratch, and he only relented as time passed. When Stephen Moffat took over, he was more comfortable using elements of Doctor Who mythology, as symbolised in the 11th hour when the newly regenerated 11th Doctor stepped into a stream of holograms showing his previous incarnations. "Hello, I'm the Doctor," he observed, claiming his decades of history basically run. But Chris Chibnall has gone too far. He has commissioned scripts that felt very much like old school Doctor Who episodes. I don't really agree with that sentiment. Not so much that he hasn't gone too far with the fan service, because I do think that The Timeless Child to some length does alienate casual viewers, but more so the idea that his episodes felt more like old episodes. Tonally, they don't really feel like the classic show. Visually, they don't look like the classic show. Pacing-wise, they're not really like the classic show, so I'd be interested to know what they mean by felt very much like old school episodes. It's not really difficult to imagine Orphan 55 split into 3 or 4 parts. Again, I'm not sure whether I agree. It would be hard to imagine that for me, but I guess I understand what they're saying in the sense that it kind of feels like an old school Base Under Siege, I guess. But I just think the idea of it being a Base Under Siege is not enough to make it feel like a classic Doctor Who story. Because then, by that logic, something like the Satan Pit and the Impossible Planet, that would also feel like a classic Doctor Who story, which it doesn't to me. It has a very New Who vibe. and there are even potential cliffhanger moments where the episode breaks could have taken place. Also, can I just point out, they're acting as though he wrote Orphan 55, which I don't believe he did. I believe Ed Hine was behind Orphan 55. So the example they're using wasn't even written by Chibnall, and I understand that this is a look at the era as a whole, but they're talking specifically about Chris Chibnall and issues he's had. So why bring up a story that he had no involvement in writing? Obviously, I understand he may have been an advisor because he does like to have his hand in a lot of the pies in his era, but I think it's disingenuous to suggest that Orphan 55 is an example of his love for Classic Who getting in the way of stories when he had really no involvement in Orphan 55 for the most part, as far as we're aware. And his love for classic stories was, oddly enough, perfectly demonstrated in his Timeless Child retcon. The Timeless Child concept places the classic series above the new, because it fits surprisingly well with lots of mysterious clues and enigmatic hints in the original series. No, it doesn't. Just because it has the Morbius Doctors in it also doesn't mean that it necessarily fits in with the classic show. People like to bring up things like the Doctor saying all those mysterious things in things like Remembrance and Silver Nemesis, but that was never meant to be the Timeless Child. As for the Morbius Doctors themselves, that was never meant to be something that was taken seriously. So it doesn't really fit in with what the classic series was going for in either case. Superficially, yeah, I guess adding more to Gallifreyan mythology and having the Doctor be more involved in that is something that the Cartman Master Plan wanted to do, but I don't think it fits in entirely with what Classic Who was going for. But clashes massively with the ideas developed under Davies and Moffat. I agree with that. It was, in fact, a story Chibnall dreamed up when he was watching Doctor Who back in the 1980s. I've said before, it feels very much like that. And he implemented it even though it didn't fit especially well anymore. Again, I agree with that. Chris Chibnall's companions were underdeveloped. Now this one, I think, is just a point where, yeah, these guys are just right. Like, the companions are underdeveloped. But I'm interested to see how they decide to demonstrate that. When Russell T Davies relaunched Doctor Who in 2005, he recognised that the format needed to be updated for modern viewers. The most important change was to make the companions the heart of the story, the lens through which viewers saw the Doctor and interpreted the Doctor's actions. This narrative approach meant Davies' companions were richly developed characters simply to ensure people could empathise with them, and he devoted a remarkable amount of time to developing their personal lives as well. Sadly, Chibnall decided to ditch this idea. Although he started the TARDIS with one of the most interesting potential crews to date, he didn't spend much time fleshing them out as individuals. There were occasional standout stories. Demons of the Punjab shone a light on Yaz. No, it didn't. It showed her family. But Yaz herself, if you go back and watch that episode, it really doesn't tell you much about Yaz that we didn't already know. It's more about her family than it is anything else. You know, I remember when that episode was coming out, the hype around, oh, a Yaz-centric episode, we're going to learn some more about Yaz. But if you go back and watch it, we really don't learn anything new. It's not like Father's Day, where you learn a lot about Rose's sense of loss over never having a dad and her desire to see him before he passes away. You learn a lot about the way that she was raised in that episode with Jackie telling her stories about her dad, which led to this desire to see him. Whereas with this, all you learn is that Yaz had a nan in the partition of India. We don't really explore why that affects Yaz as a person a lot, at least in my opinion. While Can You Hear Me finally introduced viewers to Ryan's friends. That's not true. He was seen in Spyfall Part 1. That's just objectively not correct. But these were few and far between. It didn't help that the Chibnall era frequently sidelined the Doctor's companions, sending them on B-plot side missions while the Doctor focused on the A-plot. Chibnall saw the Doctor as the viewpoint character, rather than the companions who seemed to exist purely to give the Doctor a sense of belonging. Consequently, several major defining moments in the 13th Doctor's life, such as the discovery of Joe Martin's Forgotten Doctor, or even the Timeless Child reveal, focus purely on the Doctor's reactions. But, given this is an ancient and enigmatic being, that really wasn't a great approach. Any incarnation of the Doctor is better understood through their interpreters. I do agree. So I will give this article credit where it's due. It does get some points down well, I think, but there are some things where it either just misinterprets certain things or just is poorly researched in some areas. Like, we didn't get introduced to Ryan's friends in Can You Hear Me? They were introduced in Spyfall. And if anything, Can You Hear Me has more of a focus on Yaz than Demons of the Punjab does, because at least there you learn about her depression. Granted, it's too late. But I find it weird that they used Demons of the Punjab as the example for Yaz's character when arguably Can You Hear Me would have been the better one. But I'll get off the Demons of the Punjab point now. The storytelling problems of the Chibnall era. Chris Chibnall's storytelling choices have been seriously problematic, with far too many scripts depending on third act twists that weren't effectively signposted throughout the episode. But there aren't really that many twists in his mainline stories though. The Timeless Children, is a good example of there being a twist. And I guess you could say things like When We Fell to Earth, where 13 downloads the tentacle monster thing into her Sonic to defeat Dave Shaw. I guess that's a twist. But a lot of his episodes kind of just plod along without much real twists or turns. Like, you can't use The Timeless Children as the one and only example for his writing, because it's not the only example of a story that he's told, which fairly bombarded viewers with new plot elements in order to finally reveal the truth about the Timeless Child. In narrative terms, it's clumsy and frustrating, and it leads to audiences feeling increasingly disengaged. I agree. The Chibnall era has attempted to give Doctor Who something of a social edge, but again, it's been done inconsistently. Chibnall's Doctor Who has ignored the problem of British racism, a particularly frustrating choice given the showrunner set up the most diverse team in history. I wouldn't say he ignored the problem of it, because in Rosa they literally mention the racism that they face in Britain, but I do get what they mean in the sense that when this era has spoken about racism, they tend to talk about America, which, I guess is definitely a point. But I suppose, depending on where a show is made in the world, there's always going to be a bias to that place. That's just how it is. Not saying that's correct necessarily, but that's the same with like any show across the world. They have a bias to where they're made. What's more, when major cultural issues such as climate change have been confronted, they've been done in a blunt and overbearing manner. Orphan 55 is a perfect example, with the Doctor coming close to breaking the fourth wall and giving a lecture to people who were tuning in. Doctor Who has always been quite political, with stories loosely inspired by the UK's joining in what would become the European Union in the 1970s, and a number of episodes criticising Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, but it's usually handled a little more creatively. Again, I do agree. Pacing has been a core problem in recent Doctor Who stories. Davis and Moffat typically stressed the Doctor as a man of action, and even when the Doctor was given a lecture to his baffled companions, he was on the go, either walking at speed or gesticulating wildly. These were not just affectations though, they maintained narrative momentum, preventing the Doctor's info dumps bringing the story to a screaming halt. In contrast, the Chibnall era photography is usually steady and stable, with cameras frequently focusing on the Doctor's face as she still stands and talks. Hang on, I'm a bit confused there by what their original point was. They started off talking about pacing, which I assume they were referring to narrative pacing, but then they were talking about the pace of the cameras themselves. I don't know whether they're trying to say how the cameras communicate the pacing of the narrative, or whether they're just talking about camera speeds now. Either way, I think that's a really inconsistent argument, because you're shifting the goalpost one from pacing to then all of a sudden talking about cameras and how quick they are. I do get what they're saying though with regards to Jodie being still and talking a lot. That does happen a lot. But I just don't get what the camera's steady and stable use really has to do with the pacing of the narrative itself. This approach breaks engagement, making the lectures stand out from the rest of the story, so they become, all viewers remember, a talking face. I've said before, there are a lot of close-ups on faces in Chibnall's era, so that is right. Was the Timeless Child a mistake? This article, I will say, seems to have a bizarre, solid focus on just the Timeless Child. And I'm not saying that it's not an issue, but I just think that there is more to this era than just that. And I think just laser focusing in on that, at that point you might as well just do an entire article based on that, which I believe they have done. But this is meant to be an overview of the entire era, not just the Timeless Child and a couple other episodes. If you're going to critique an entire era, you really have to take all of it into account. It is, of course, impossible to evaluate the Chris Chibnall era without focusing on the Timeless Child. I mean, that's kind of all you've done in this article, to be honest. Like, the majority of it is about the Timeless Child already. For better or worse, this will define Chibnall's term as showrunner. But while this retcon has already proved deeply divisive, it is actually too soon to reach any conclusions on the matter. Chibnall has laid a new foundation for the Doctor, but he has yet to build upon it. Hopefully, he will complete his work on Doctor Who Series 13 and the subsequent specials, allowing the Timeless Child retcon to be assessed in completion. So there was really no point about whether it was a bad idea there or not. They were basically just saying, we'll have to wait and see. And can I just say as well, the way an arc is told can be bad before we see the resolution. Just because it hasn't ended yet doesn't mean people can't critique the Timeless Child arc itself. That's just a little side rant that I needed to have, because I feel like people think that just because it hasn't ended, we can't have any criticisms of the Timeless Child arc so far. If what we've had so far hasn't been great, which in my opinion it hasn't particularly, then people should be able to say that without people going, oh well, it hasn't finished yet. The Chibnall era has sadly been deeply flawed. There is, however, reason to hope for Doctor Who Season 13. The serialized approach Chibnall is taking plays to its strengths because it moves to a longer form of storytelling, where he has already excelled in the past. It won't be enough to redeem this period of Doctor Who's history, but hopefully it will end it on a better note. So yeah, that was the ScreenRant article on the Chibnall era. Again, a lot of surface level arguments that are said a lot, and it's not that I necessarily disagree with a lot of the arguments put forward, but I just think that a lot of them feel very much regurgitated without much thought. But let me know what you guys think of this article in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe if you're new, like if you enjoyed, and I will see you later.